Story number 5. They say some places don't want to be found, that they hide themselves from maps, from footsteps, even from memory. And sometimes those places aren't lost. They're guarding something, waiting for someone foolish enough to come looking. I was that fool once, and I've never stopped paying the price. Before I knew the truth about Atagahi, before I had ever heard its name spoken in a whisper around dying campfires, I was just a man with a sick child and a hope too strong to surrender. Hope is a dangerous thing when mixed with desperation. It can lead a man to trespass on sacred ground, and worse, to think he's entitled to its gifts. But let me begin at the only place this story can start, with the warning I didn't heed. Deep within the most remote wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains, where ancient Cherokee hunting paths disappear into mist and shadows, there exists a place that appears on no modern map, a location so sacred and so dangerous that speaking its name aloud is said to invite catastrophe upon your entire bloodline. The Cherokee called it Atagahi, the Enchanted Lake, and for countless generations before white settlers ever set foot in these mountains, it served as nature's most closely guarded secret, a place where the laws of life and death factored in. To forces older than human civilization, nobody alive had ever seen it, but the old stories painted it vividly. A place made not for humans, but for the beasts of the forest, their private sanctuary. It was told in fragments, in bedtime tales with sharpened warnings at the end, like blades hidden in velvet. I wasn't raised to believe in magic. I was raised to track deer by hoof prints and listen to the wind for signs of rain. But when my son Sequoia fell ill, truly, inexplicably ill, none of those practical things mattered anymore. The mountain's natural cures failed him. Despite the efforts of the Ville's most powerful medicine men, despite every herb and ritual in their considerable arsenal, Sequoia continued to grow weaker with each passing day. And then came the night of the frost wolves. The village dogs howled all evening, not at the moon, but at something moving beyond the tree line, silent, unseen. Sequoia's fever had climbed beyond the measure of any thermometer, and his breathing was no longer steady. I sat beside him, helpless, staring at the flicker of the oil lamp, and prayed to a God I wasn't sure still listened. It wasn't until the oldest man in the village came to our door that the stories truly began to change me. Old Tomb had survived more winters than anyone else. Blind in one eye, walking with a carved blackwood staff and a necklace of dried herbs. He smelled like smoke and he leaned in close, whispered in my ear, "There is a lake that does not welcome men, but it hears beasts, and sometimes it listens to the desperate." I stared at him. "You mean Atagahi?" He flinched at the name. "You should not speak it, but yes, that place, it's real. And if you go looking for it, it may kill you. Or worse, it may change you." I asked him if he had seen it. "No," he said. "But I have seen what it made. A man returned from it once, not all the way human, not all the way right. And the woods haven't been safe since that was my first warning. And like most warnings given too late, it landed as more curiosity than caution. The next morning, I set out with only a pack, a hunting knife, and a single goal: find the lake. The journey to find Atagahi took Kanuna deep into parts of the Smoky Mountains that no Cherokee had explored for generations. Using fragments of ancient stories and half-remembered directions from legends passed down by the elders, he searched for weeks through treacherous terrain, following animal tracks that seemed to lead toward a destination that existed more in the spirit world than in physical reality. Yes, I wandered for days. The trees got taller, the undergrowth more tangled. The woods were no longer passive observers of my presence. They recoiled. Birds didn't sing. Deer didn't run. Everything avoided me as if I carried death on my boots. Then came the third week. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. My body ached with exhaustion and cold. I found myself beside a dry creek bed, crumbling from dehydration. As he sat exhausted and hopeless beside a creek that seemed to lead nowhere, Kanuna began to pray with an intensity born of absolute desperation. He offered his own life to the Great Spirit in exchange for his son's healing. I whispered, "Take me if you want, just leave him." And then the stone wall moved. No wind, no quake, just movement where there should have been none. A shimmer rippled across the surface of a boulder the size of a wagon, and behind it, darkness. A hole no bigger than a bear's den. It wasn't just a cave, it was a passage. Something ancient and watching. From inside, I heard a song. No voice, no language, but I knew it called to me. It knew my name, and though every instinct screamed at me to run, I stepped forward. I did not know then that every step I took in that tunnel would take me further from being a man. The tunnel swallowed the light behind me. Not gradually, completely. 1 second, there was sky, and the next, nothing but silence and blackness, so thick it felt like cloth pressed against my eyes. But I didn't stop. My hands brushed the walls on either side, tracing stone to stone that pulsed faintly with a warmth like breath. The air here smelled of wet earth, roots, and something else, something sweet and rotten, like fruit fallen too long from the tree. I moved by instinct, deeper into the womb of the mountain, following a path that twisted and turned as if it were alive. I thought it would be narrow and cramped, but no. The cave system that led to Atagahi was unlike anything Kanuna had ever experienced. The passages twisted and branched in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics, sometimes leading upward when they should have led down, sometimes opening into vast chambers that were far too large to fit within the mountains that contained them. The walls weren't just stone, they were strays. I passed murals that shimmered with iridescent light, depicting scenes that shifted as I moved past them. One showed a deer drinking from violet water, its broken legs straightening before my eyes. Another showed a man, Cherokee like me, clutching a bottle at the lake's edge, his face contorted in agony as spectral hands pulled him down beneath the surface. And then there were the spirit beasts, Sruskis. At first, I thought they were part of the paintings, but then I saw their eyes, glowing eyes, amber, silver, violet, watching me from the walls. Shapes like bears, wolves, owls larger than eagles. They were not merely illustrations. They were sentinels, woven into the bones of the mountain itself. As Kanuna descended deeper into the cave system, he began to encounter the guardians of Atagahi, spirits that took the form of enormous animals with eyes that burned like stars and voices that could speak directly into his mind. I heard the first one before I saw it. A voice, deep as stone cracking underwater, echoed not in my ears, but inside my ribs. Why do you walk where no flesh should tread? I turned and found it waiting, an enormous bear, standing upright, its fur gleaming like night sky, constellations woven across its back. Its gaze pinned me still. Hishtits. I seek healing, I answered, for my son. He is dying. The bear's eyes narrowed. You may pass, desperate father, but know that every step you take toward the lake binds you more tightly to a fate you cannot imagine. The healing waters exact a price that mortals are rarely willing to pay. That phrase hung in the cave like incense, heavy, bitter, impossible to ignore. I bowed, not out of fear, but gratitude. It stepped aside. The cave narrowed, dipped sharply, and opened into a corridor lit by bioluminescent moss. The light flickered like fireflies trapped beneath water. I saw more spirits now, not just one, a panther with wings, a red fox with 3 tails, a great serpent whose scales shimmered with mirrored reflections. None of them spoke, but they all followed. I had become a trespasser, and they were my silent jury. But after what felt like days without food, water, or any sense of time, the passage widened. And then light, not the cold, distant blue of day. This light was violet and warm, radiant and pulsing like a heartbeat. The lake, the final chamber of the cave system, opened onto a sight that struck Kanuna speechless with wonder and terror. Atagai spread before him like a vision from the realm of the gods, its violet waters glowing with an inner light that made the entire hidden valley shimmer like a dream. It was real. It had always been real. Well, perfectly circular, perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by cliffs that rose straight up into a sky that seemed different from the one he had left behind. Deeper, more purple, filled with stars that moved in patterns that hurt his eyes to follow. Around the lake's edge, creatures drank and bathed, animals that had no business existing side by side. Wolves beside deer, hawks beside rabbits. Their injuries healed before my eyes, flesh knitting, bones realigning, feathers smoothing as if death itself had been reversed. But this was not peace. This was sacred order, one that I had just violated by arriving here. Still, I stepped forward, tears blurring my vision. I saw at the lake's edge a flower with petals the color of midnight. I saw stones glowing like embers. I saw hope, and then I remembered my purpose. I pulled the flask from my satchel. My fingers trembled as I knelt to fill it. But as Kanuna reached for the water bottle he had brought with him, every animal around the lake suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at him. The peaceful harmony of the scene shattered like glass, replaced by a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. A massive elk, its antlers spanning wider than a man could reach, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that resonated through both air and spirit. Human, You have been permitted to witness the healing of Atagahi, but you have not been granted permission to take from its waters. Leave now while mercy is still possible. I froze? What kind of father walks away from salvation? What kind of man lets his son die because of tradition? So I made my choice. I dipped the bottle into the violet water. The instant the surface was disturbed, the world broke open. The sky, once peaceful, roared into motion. The stars spun wildly in unnatural spirals. The animals around me began to shift. Bears with claws like obsidian spears, birds that grew into skeletal shadows with eyes like burning coals, elk whose antlers pierced the clouds. From the depths of Atagahi rose a figure that was both beautiful and terrifying. The spirit of the lake herself, a being of such power and majesty that looking directly at her was like staring into the sun. She was tall as a tree with skin that shifted between human flesh and flowing water, hair that moved like waterfalls, and eyes that held the wisdom and wrath of centuries. She stepped from the lake, the water folding away from her like curtains. "Kanuna of the Cherokee," she said, her voice echoing across every cell in my body. "You have stolen from the sacred waters, violated the ancient compact between spirit and flesh. This transgression cannot go unpunished." I knelt. "Take me, but spare him." A pause. "Your love for your dying child has soothed the heart of the Great Spirit," she said. "Therefore, you will be offered a choice." They say real choices are rare. Most of what we do is habit, instinct, the flow of life nudging us this way or that. But every once in a while, the world cracks open and lays a fork in your path. Two roads, both terrible, neither clean, and you must choose, not for what it brings you, but for what it takes away. I stood at the edge of eternity, a thief with a stolen miracle in my hands. The lake spirit stood before me, radiant, unreadable, terrifying. But your love for your dying child has moved the heart of the Great Spirit. Therefore, you will be offered a choice that will determine not just your fate, but the fate of all humans who might seek to exploit the gifts meant for innocent creatures. Her words rippled through the air like waves through still water. The other spirit beasts gathered behind her, forming a wall of ancient judgment. Bears with stars for eyes, birds with wings wide as thunder clouds, foxes whose bodies flickered like flame. And then came the offer. You may keep the healing water and save your son's life, but in doing so, you will become the eternal guardian of Atagahi, bound to protect the lake from future human trespassers by any means necessary. I swallowed hard. She wasn't threatening me. She was offering duty. You will be transformed into something more than human, but less than spirit, granted immortality and supernatural power, but forever separated from the mortal world you have known. The price was high, too high for any sane man, but I wasn't a sane man anymore. I was a father. That changes the arithmetic. She stepped closer, her body half woman, half river. Her presence was overwhelming, like a waterfall crashing over my skin and soul. Alternatively, you may pour the stolen water back into the lake, she continued, her tone heavy with gravity. Accept your son's death as the will of the Great Spirit and return to your village to live out your natural life. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was waiting, a universal stillness that stretched across time. My hands shook. I looked at the bottle. Inside, the violet water shimmered like liquid starlight. I thought of Sequoia, his little fingers wrapped around mine as he slept, his breath shallow, his body shrinking like a candle near its end. I remembered the night he was born, the way he wailed with life, how my heart had felt too big for my chest. And now I had his life in my hands. How could I let him die, knowing I had held salvation? But how could I live if I was no longer a man? I asked the Spirit, if I choose to stay, will he know what I did? She studied me for a long time, then nodded. In dreams, in blood. Your sacrifice will echo through his soul, even if your voice never does. Then I made the only decision that ever felt like destiny. I choose him, I whispered. As the healing water touched his lips in a ritual that sealed his transformation, Kanuna felt his humanity drain away like water through sand, replaced by something ancient and implacable that cared more about protecting the sacred than about human feelings or desires. Pain tore through me, not pain of flesh, but identity. I felt my body twist and harden, my bones groaned as they elongated. My skin darkened, glowing faintly with the same violet shimmer as the lake. My breath came slower, heavier, charged with power and ancient memory. I saw through time. I felt every animal that had ever healed here. I heard their thanks, I heard their cries, and I understood I had become a part of the lake's covenant, a weapon forged from love and debt. The Spirit stepped back, nodding once. You are now of the lake. I don't remember how I returned to the village. Time warped around me. The forest parted without resistance. Birds flew ahead of me like an honor guard. The trees bowed. The wind carried my scent back to those waiting for me, back to my son. The healing water worked exactly as promised. Sequoia was cured immediately, his wasting disease vanishing like morning mist, his strength and vitality restored as if he had never been ill. The moment I stepped into the village, they knew something had changed. Children stopped playing. Elders lowered their eyes. Dogs cowered. And Sequoia, my sweet boy, ran into my arms, newly strong, laughing like sunlight. I held him, my last embrace. His warmth, a searing reminder of everything I was about to lose. Then the changes accelerated. My eyes glowed. My voice carried harmonics that made listeners' bones ache. My skin rippled like a reflection in moving water. I could see the future and the past. I could hear lies and truths without being told. I knew then that I could no longer stay. The Cherokee elders, recognizing the signs of spiritual transformation, understood that Kanuna was no longer truly one of them. With grief heavy on their faces, they prepared the ritual of separation, a sacred rite to sever my human ties and release me to the wild. I did not resist. Shit. On the final night, I stood at the edge of the village. Sequoia was asleep in his bed. I kissed his forehead one last time. My tears left glowing drops on his pillow. He stirred and whispered, half asleep, "Thank you, Father." And then I walked into the mountains and was never seen again, at least not as Kanuna. I had become the guardian. But the story does not end there, because the lake is still hidden, and people are still looking for it. Generations passed, and the name Kanuna faded from memory. But the legend did not die. It changed form. It grew teeth. They call me different names now, in whispered tales shared around campfires by hikers and rangers. They say a figure roams the farthest reaches of the Smoky Mountains. A tall, powerfully built man with skin that seemed to shift between human flesh and flowing water, eyes that glowed with violet light, and an aura of such primal power that wild animals would flee at his approach. They call me the Violet Man, and I have seen them, those who come soul searching, not for solitude, not for beauty, but for miracles. They don't say it out loud, but I see it in their eyes. The mother with the too small backpack and the bone-thin boy beside her. The old man who moves like he's carrying anchors in his lungs. The young couple who walks too fast, too purposeful, as if they're chasing something they don't yet believe in. I appear to them, not always in the same form. Sometimes I'm a shadow in the mist. Sometimes I take the shape of a bear with glowing fur. But when they see me, they know what I am. Their instincts scream. And then I give them what I was given, a choice. These encounters followed a disturbing pattern. The figure who came to be known among mountain folk as the Violet Man would appear to travelers who seemed to be searching for something more than just a pleasant hike through the woods. He had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was seeking the legendary healing lake. Whether they knew its true name or had simply heard rumors of a place where miraculous cures could be found, I warned them, turn back now or lose more than you can imagine. Most do. Their hunger falters in the face of fear. They see something in me, something old and broken and far too close to monstrous, and they retreat. They return to the trailhead with shaking hands and a sudden disinterest in folklore. But some don't. Some, driven by desperation or greed or simple human stubbornness, chose to ignore his advice and press deeper into the wilderness. They never make it to the lake. Atagahai knows how to protect itself now. The mountain folds in strange ways. The caves vanish. The wind changes direction. The guardians rouse from sleep. And when those foolish few are found, it's never by me. Trust, they come in ones and twos. Hunters, treasure seekers, spiritual tourists. And every year, the list of the missing grows longer. These individuals were never seen alive again, though their bodies were sometimes found weeks or months later in circumstances that baffled investigators. The corpses were always discovered in positions that suggested extreme terror or profound awe. Some were clutching flowers that don't exist in any known botanical records. Others bore expressions of serene ecstasy, as if they'd glimpsed paradise and couldn't survive its beauty. But they had one thing in common. violet stains on their fingertips. Wretch. Last spring, a drone caught an image. It was blurry, heat distorted, zoomed too far. But it showed a man standing alone on a cliffside deep in the Smokies. Skin gleaming purple, eyes lit like dying stars. The internet buzzed for a week. Gee, some said it was a hoax. Some said it was a glitch. But others, they remembered stories from their grandparents. The ones whispered when the fire burned low. There's a man who guards the lake that heals the world. He used to be one of us. Now he's something else. As for me, I no longer count the years. I do not sleep. I do not eat. I do not die. I walk, geek, through mist and root and memory, through time, through lives I'll never live. I see Sequoia sometimes, in the dreams of his descendants. A boy in a hospital room, a girl praying in a forest, a soldier weeping beneath starlight. And I protect them, all of them, because that is the price I paid. That is the oath I gave. And as long as Atagahi lives, so do I. That epilogue. Some gifts are not meant to be taken. Some miracles are not meant to be stolen. The lake is still there, hidden, not waiting to be found, but daring you to try. Story number 6. They say a bride is supposed to glow on her wedding day. Mine burned, not with joy, but with fury, born of betrayal. The Greenbrier Lodge was built for the elite, yet its walls couldn't stop a heart from breaking or a soul for seeking revenge. I walked down the aisle like a queen entering her crypt. Every eye admired me, yet no one saw I was already dead inside. Love doesn't die, but when it's buried alive beneath silk and lies, it becomes something else entirely. Tushtish. He whispered victory in my ear. I replied with silence and a smile, the kind only ghosts wear. I never planned to haunt a place. I never believed in ghosts. But death has a way of clarifying things. The day I arrived at Greenbrier Lodge, the mountains looked as if they'd been set aflame. Leaves the color of rust and blood cascaded down the hillsides, whispering ancient truths I couldn't yet hear. Lydia May. Why was 23 years old when she arrived at the Greenbrier Lodge in September of 13, and she was without question the most beautiful woman anyone at the resort had ever seen. Beauty is a dangerous kind of armor. It makes people assume you're untouchable, when in truth, it can be a prison lined with gold. My family, polished and proud, arrived with trunks of lace and crystal, hiding the stench of desperation under layers of wealth. Lydia possessed the kind of beauty that seemed almost supernatural in its perfection. But behind my emerald eyes was a woman sentenced to a marriage arranged not for love, but for leverage. They called him Thomas Ashford III, heir, bachelor. Thomas Ashford was 42 years old, nearly twice Lydia's age, with a reputation for cruelty and debauchery. His gaze never met mine with affection, only appraisal, as if tallying up the worth of a thoroughbred mare. I was the answer to my father's debt, the price of his privilege. And then came James. He wasn't supposed to be part of the story. a hunting guide with soil beneath his fingernails and poetry in his soul. Our paths crossed in the lodge's stables, I in riding boots far too clean, he with a saddle slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. He bowed, but not from obligation, from instinct, from a kind of honor I thought only existed in books. James came from a poor mountain family that had lived in the Smokies for generations, but he possessed an education and refinement that rivaled any gentleman Lydia had ever known. In a world full of men who wanted to own me, James was the first who asked what I wanted. We spoke in fragments, like wild things learning a language not meant for them. At first, we just rode. Then we talked. Then we hid. The first kiss happened beneath a canopy of scarlet leaves, where sunlight filtered through like stained glass. I remember the way he touched my face, like it was already vanishing. That's the trouble with stolen moments. You start to believe you deserve more. They would meet in secret, stealing moments together in hidden clearings and abandoned cabins, sharing dreams and fears, and planning a future that seemed impossible. I told him I'd rather starve in a shack with him than drown in velvet beside Ashford, and I meant it. But dreams don't weigh as much as diamonds, and love doesn't negotiate with money. As Halloween approached, the chosen date for my doom, our plans grew reckless. Mexico, Canada, the mountains. We conjured escape in every direction, but always, something pulled us back. Reality is heavier than fantasy, especially when your father's men are watching your every move. She had begged, pleaded, threatened, and even attempted to run away twice, only to be caught and brought back by her father's hired men. My wrists still bore bruises from the second attempt. I covered them with lace gloves. A lady, after all, must maintain appearances. We made one final promise. Meet me in the library. Noon. 1 hour before the wedding. If he was there, I'd run. I'd tear the dress, burn the guest list. I'd choose love over legacy. She would leave with James regardless of the consequences, abandoning her family and her fortune for the chance at true happiness. I waited in that room as the grandfather clock groaned through the minutes. First hope, then worry, then dread. But when Lydia reached the library, she found it empty. She waited for 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. James never came. I held his letter in my hands, not a love note, but a map. He had traced a road out of town. I followed it with my finger, like it might lead to him. But maps are useless when the person you're chasing is already gone. At 12:45, I stood alone, not just in the room, as in the world. Lydia finally accepted the terrible truth. The man she loved had abandoned her. I walked the corridor in silence. My gown trailed behind me like a broken promise. People turned, smelled, whispered, some cried, but no one stopped me. They said I was the most beautiful bride they'd ever seen. I was, because beauty is what they bury you in. There was no music in my head as I walked toward the altar, only the hollow rhythm of my heels on polished marble, like a heartbeat that had forgotten its purpose. At exactly 1 p.m. on October 31st, 1939, Lydia May, walked down the aisle, of the Greenbrier Lodge's grand ballroom. The chandeliers above glittered like 1,000 frozen stars, too bright for a day so cursed. 100 faces turned to watch me pass, none of them seeing me. I wasn't the bride. I was the offering. The assembled guests saw a radiant bride moving gracefully toward her future husband, but those who looked closely could see the tears streaming down her face. And he waited at the end of the aisle, Thomas Ashford, grinning like the devil who knew the deal was already signed. When I reached him, I paused, not from nerves, but because my legs refused to obey the soul still trapped inside them. Thomas Ashford stood at the altar wearing a satisfied smirk, monsieur, and he looked like a man who had just won a particularly challenging game. I could smell the champagne on his breath before he even whispered, "You belong to me now," he murmured. "No more games, Lydia." I didn't reply. I just stared at the minister. My voice would not betray me again, not until it had to. The wedding ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and grandeur that money could buy. But beneath the orchestral strings and murmured prayers, I heard the echo of my own heartbeat folding in on itself. Amol, this is the moment, I told myself. Say no, Pique. But the words stuck like glass in my throat. When the time came for her to say, "I do," there was a moment of silence so profound that the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. And then, like a coward, like a girl who had already died the moment her love vanished, I whispered the words that made me a wife. The applause came, but it didn't touch me. Thomas kissed me. It wasn't tender. It was claiming, like the lid of a coffin closing. That night, the party went on as if the bride hadn't just buried her own heart. The reception that followed was a lavish affair. But Lydia moved through it all like a ghost. That line would be repeated many times by the guests later, but they didn't understand how true it was. I was already leaving them. They said the honeymoon suite was the most romantic room in the entire lodge. Vaulted ceilings, mahogany furniture, a fireplace that crackled with warmth. But all I saw was silk rope. I remember reaching for it the way you reach for water in a burning house. Desperation, determination. Standing alone in the honeymoon suite, still wearing her wedding dress, but with her veil torn and her bouquet crushed. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. Even my pain had become too elegant to express itself in anything so crude. The rope had once held back the curtains. Tonight, it would hold back no more. I tied the knot slowly, methodically, like I was sewing the last seam of a cursed dress. I dragged the chair, climbed, and looked out the window one last time. The mountains didn't weep for me. They never do. Lydia dragged a chair to the center of the room, directly beneath the main ceiling beam. She managed to secure the rope to the beam and slipped the noose around her neck. I closed my eyes. Oh, but the door creaked. I opened them and saw James. He was filthy, bleeding, his coat ripped, his eyes wild with panic. "Lydia, don't!" he choked out, stumbling toward me. Time slowed. The rope slipped from my hands, and I fell, not from a beam, but into his arms. For a moment, a cruel, brilliant, impossible moment, I believed we had been given a second chance. Then the gunshot echoed through the hallway. James jerked. I felt the warmth bloom between us. He fell. I screamed, a scream that shook the walls and summoned the staff, the guests, the ghosts. Thomas stood at the threshold, still holding the revolver. His face twisted with something between rage and satisfaction. "You would have left me at the altar," he said. "That would have made me look like a fool. But this makes you mine forever." I don't remember the next few moments. I think part of me died again. Not from grief, but from the kind of clarity that shatters the mind. They say I jumped. Some say I hung. Others say I walked out the window and disappeared into the mist, veil flowing behind me like a banner of vengeance. But I remember this. I wasn't afraid, because love doesn't die, but sometimes it comes back wearing white. They tried to clean the blood from the carpet, replace the beams, repaint the walls. But no matter how many coats of white they used, the memory bled through, because the Greenbrier Lodge does not forget. The day after my death, they told the guests I had slipped, that the wedding night had been too much, that grief had driven me to madness. The scandal her death would cause was expertly wrapped in the silk of polite society and hushed rumors. James's body was removed in silence, buried far from the lodge, without a marker. Thomas told them he was a thief, a criminal, that I had been deceived by mountain trash and had paid the price. But some of them knew better. There was a chambermaid, Eliza, who found my veil shredded beneath the fireplace. She never spoke of it, but I saw her fingers tremble every time she passed my door. There was a boy who worked in the kitchens, no more than 15, who refused to ever go near the West Wing again. He left that winter, said the mirrors whispered, said he saw a woman in white walking the halls with flowers in her hand and nothing in her eyes. And then there was the ballroom. No one dances there anymore. The first haunting was subtle, a breeze with no source, a perfume lingering where no guests had walked, footsteps along the third-floor corridor, always at 12:40 a.m. The exact time I had accepted, I had been abandoned. Lydia moved through it all like a ghost, smiling when spoken to, dancing when required, but clearly absent in every way that mattered. They buried me in a family plot I had never visited, but the lodge kept my breath. My sorrow seeped into the wood, into the wine-soaked carpet, into the crystal chandeliers that still swing ever so slightly when no one is near. Years passed, yet guests still came. Wealth and whiskey still flowed, but I remained. I didn't seek revenge. Not at first. I didn't know what I was. I wandered. My gown trailing behind me, my fingers brushing books in the library where I waited for a man who never came, my veil catching on doorknobs, my bouquet rotting in the moonlight. But he came back. Thomas, 32 days after the funeral. He arrived with another woman, younger than me, even, blonde, nervous. He had married again. The staff watched him lead her through the lodge like nothing had happened. He gave her my room, the honeymoon suite. That night, I stood at the foot of their bed. She couldn't see me, but he did. He sat up, pale, shivering. The way he used to make me feel. I didn't touch him. I only watched. He left the lodge the next morning, alone. She would later be found wandering the woods in her nightgown, whispering my name. The stories began. The bride who waits, the ghost in the veil, the woman by the window. Some say I only appear on Halloween, in the reflection of the grand ballroom's mirror. Others say I never left at all, as if a soul had simply departed her body the moment she became Mrs. Thomas Ashford. They're all right and all wrong, because I'm not just a ghost. I'm a reminder, a warning in white. And each time another girl walks into this lodge with a ring she doesn't want and a man she doesn't love, I see her. I follow her. And sometimes, if she listens closely, I help her leave, because I couldn't. There was one, her name was Evelyn. She came in 1952, engaged to a banker from Atlanta. I saw her weep in the same library chair where I had once waited. I placed a rose on her pillow that night. No one else could have. The doors had been locked. She left the next morning, her wedding canceled. Another girl, 30 years later, ran screaming from the bridal suite after she saw a figure hanging from the ceiling, only to find the beam intact and the rope vanished. But the pain is still here. The walls remember, the floorboards ache with it. Even the fire flickers differently in my presence. And as for Thomas, he died alone, in a sanatorium, mumbled nonsense in his final years. But in every recorded interview, he only said one thing that made sense. She's still wearing the dress. So yes, I haunt, but not from vengeance, from heartbreak, and from the knowledge that even in death, a woman must fight to be believed. Ghosts don't measure time the way the living do. We remember through emotion, not minutes. The clock in the library, the one that ticked away my final hour as a bride, stopped the moment I died. No one ever fixed it. Some say it just refuses to stay wound, that its gears grind and halt every time a bride walks into the lodge. But I know why it stopped. Because I stopped, and no one ever asked if I wanted to be found again. Decades passed, generations shifted. The lodge was modernized, Wi-Fi, espresso machines, online bookings. But the bones of the place remained the same. So did I. There are fewer who believe now, fewer who listen. But that only makes my presence stronger. Skepticism doesn't dispel spirits. It invites them, especially when blood still stains the corners of your wallpaper. It was in 1997 that the lodge tried to erase me entirely. I'm a new manager, young, ambitious, determined to rebrand the narrative. He had my portrait removed from the East Hall, had my name scrubbed from the ledger, told guests the ballroom was under perpetual renovation. He didn't ask permission, so I gave him a warning the night before the grand reopening gala. His fiancée was found unconscious in the bridal suite, veil tangled around her neck, bouquet crushed into the rug, the exact pose they said I had died in. She survived. But when she woke up, she couldn't speak, not because her throat was damaged, but because some stories should not be silenced. The manager resigned, left the country. The lodge fell back into its rhythm of fear and denial, and I returned to the shadows I never chose. Sometimes I remember the scent of the horses, the cold of the river we once crossed on horseback, laughing. James, his name is still a prayer in my silence. They say love can't follow you past death, but they're wrong. His ghost never joined me, but his voice lives in the wind that pushes my veil, in the pine needles that stick to my train, in the shiver that crosses your neck when you say his name aloud near the stables. He never left me, not really, but neither could he save me. And that is the cruelest kind of love, the one that tries, fails, and stays anyway. There's one more thing you should know. There was a child. I never told anyone. He would have had James's eyes, but fate never allowed me the chance to carry him. Sometimes in my darker moments, I wonder if that's why I linger, not out of vengeance or mourning, you score, but because there's no one left to remember the child who was never born, and someone must. It is said the lodge will one day fall, fire, rot, collapse. Something will eventually end the structure, but not the story, because now I am not just a ghost. I am folklore. I am legend. I am the lesson whispered by mothers to their daughters. Don't let the world dress your cage in lace. Brides still come, and when they cry in silence, I cry with them. When they hesitate at the altar, I place a petal in their path. And when they choose to walk away, I disappear for a little while. Not gone, just satisfied. Last winter, a girl named Mira ran out into the snow in her wedding gown. I followed her. She turned around, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Thank you." I hadn't spoken in 83 years, but that night, my voice returned, just enough to whisper one word back. "Run!" She did, and for the first time in decades, I returned to the library and sat down in the same chair I once waited in. The clock ticked, the hands moved, and for just 1 second, the world turned again. I am Lydia May Y. I was a daughter, a prisoner, a corpse, but now I am a sentinel. Yes, my wedding dress has frayed, but my purpose has not, because there will always be girls like me, and I will always be here, in silk, in sorrow, in silence, waiting, watching, and reminding them, you are not alone, not anymore. Some say the dead have no future, but that's a lie told by the living to comfort themselves, because I've seen what's coming. And it's not peace, it's reckoning. They recently reopened the ballroom, painted it in whites and golds, tried to rename it the Magnolia Room, hung chandeliers that sparkled like a promise. But I was still there. The mirror, that ancient thing leaning across the far wall, it never liked being replaced. And when they tried to remove it, it cracked, clean, vertical, from top to bottom, like a seam tearing reality open. The first bride to rehearse her walk there fainted mid-aisle, said she saw someone staring back at her in the mirror, someone in the exact same dress she wore, but weeping. They say ghosts fade when they're forgotten, but memory is stronger than fear. And I am remembered, not by name, but by feeling, by flickering candlelight, by the hush before her vows, by every bride who looks at herself and wonders, what if I run? To them I say, You won't be alone. Not while I still wear the veil. Story number 7. They told me the mountains were quiet, peaceful even, that the mist rolled in like a prayer, and the trees kept their secrets like tombstones. They lied. I came to Elkmont with a backpack, a camera, and the foolish curiosity of someone who thought ghost towns were just cracked wood and peeling paint. But Elkmont isn't empty, not really, and it doesn't like being forgotten. You'll think it's beautiful at first. The trail winds through untouched forest, sunlight scattered through ancient canopies, and then there it is, a town that's not supposed to be there. Homes without owners, windows without glass, rocking chairs that move without wind. And then you hear them, children laughing where no children live, footsteps from roofs long collapsed, a woman humming in a language no one speaks anymore. You're not losing your mind. You've simply stepped into a place where memory is stronger than reality. They say time heals all wounds, but what if time is broken? What if the wound was never allowed to close? In the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, where ancient trees whisper secrets older than memory, and morning mist clings to forgotten foundations like the breath of the dead, there exists a place that shouldn't be there, a community that was erased from existence but refuses to stay gone. My first memory of Elkmont wasn't a sound or a sight. It was a feeling, like something had turned and noticed me the moment I stepped into its decaying streets. I wasn't supposed to be there, but neither were the others who hadn't left. The deeper I wandered, the more it felt intentional. The trail scenes twisted me in circles. Maps contradicted themselves. Elkmont was once a thriving mountain town, home to hundreds of families who carved their lives from the wilderness and built a society that seemed destined to last forever. They had built a community with hands calloused by logging tools and spirits hardened by mountain winters. Their homes were solid, their roots dug deep. Then the government came. But when progress came calling in the form of government agents and park officials, the entire community was systematically dismantled, its residents scattered to the winds, and its very existence nearly erased from history. You'd think a town erased would stay gone. But Elkmont didn't vanish. It hid. Or maybe it was rebuilt. From the other side, locals warned me in hushed tones and long glances toward the mountains. Elkmont wants its people back. And if you stay long enough, it might decide you belong to it too. At first, I didn't believe. But the signs came quickly. The first night, I camped near what used to be the town square. The fire burned well, no wind, no rain. Yet when I woke up, my tent had been moved 40 feet uphill, neatly pegged, zipped, and warm. My boots were lined up outside like someone wanted me to stay. What makes Elkmont truly terrifying isn't just that it was destroyed. It's that it never really died. And then I saw them, 2 children, maybe 8 years old, playing near the ruins of the general store, dressed in old-time clothes, faces clean, laughing without sound. I watched them for 5 full minutes before blinking, and they were gone. But my camera had captured nothing. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Mountain fog does strange things, refracts light, plays with distance. Maybe the kids were hikers' children or leftover actors from a historical reenactment. But even I didn't believe that, not when the footprints appeared. My second morning in Elkmont, I found 2 sets of small barefoot tracks circling my tent. They weren't mine. They weren't recent either, faint but clear in the dew, pressed into the moss like memories unwilling to fade. Then came the laughter again, but only in my head. That unmistakable sound of joy echoing through decay. I broke camp fast, but as I walked through what used to be Elkmont's downtown, more like a skeleton of it, I saw something that stopped me cold. A new structure, not restored, not renovated by the Park Service. I mean new, as in it hadn't been there yesterday. A small white house with a red door, untouched by time, glowing softly in the morning mist. There was no record of it on any historical maps. I approached slowly. No footprints, no tail marks, nothing but silence. Inside, it was fully furnished, firewood stacked, fresh linens. A rocking chair moved gently, not swaying, just moving back and forth as though someone had only just stood up. And on the mantel, a photograph of a family I didn't recognize. Father, mother, daughter, son, dressed in T20s clothes, standing in front of this very house that wasn't supposed to exist. But even as Elkmont thrived, its residents lived with an undercurrent of unease that no amount of prosperity could completely dispel. I felt that same unease now. Like the house knew me. Like it remembered me from somewhere I hadn't yet lived. The mountain air changed then, not cooler, not stormier, just heavier. Like walking into someone's memory. I turned and left, quickly, but not quickly enough. Because when I stepped outside, the sun was wrong. It wasn't the same time anymore. My watch said 10:07, but the shadows said late afternoon. The sky had deepened. Birds were silent. I looked behind me, and the house was gone. Not decayed, not collapsed. Gone. I should have left then. Any sane person would have, but Elkmont has a pull, a gravity, the kind that doesn't tug your body but your memories, the kind that makes you wonder if you were always meant to come here. Later that day, I stumbled across what had once been the Wonderland Hotel, or what should have been its ruins. Instead, I saw candlelight flickering behind broken window frames. Park rangers would report seeing smoke rising from chimneys in houses that had no roofs, lights shining from windows in buildings that had no electricity, and people moving around in yards where no people lived. I dared to peek through one of the shattered panes. Inside, a banquet was being prepared. Real food, real smells, potatoes, venison stew, cornbread. People moved about inside, faces calm, polite, distant, like a family waiting for a guest they no longer expected. One woman looked directly at me. No anger, no surprise, just a smile that felt sad. I blinked. The lights were gone. The room was empty. Rotting beams, moldy wallpaper, and a dining table collapsed under its own weight. But the scent of rosemary lingered. I slept outside that night, too afraid to find shelter. The forest around Elkmont was too still. And in the quiet, I heard voices. "Where'd you go? You were here yesterday. We saved you a seat." And then One final whisper, clear and close. Stay! The most disturbing reports involve families who claim to have been invited into Elkmont homes by phantom residents and served meals with food that they could taste and smell. But that didn't actually exist. I couldn't sleep. I sat awake, staring at the stars between tree branches, praying for dawn. But Elkmont doesn't follow the same sun. It obeys memory, not time. When daylight came, I was in a different part of the valley, not just off trail, completely disoriented. The town had moved again, or I had. I found a stone well I'd never seen before. Its bricks were old, but moss hadn't touched them. Beside it, a child's shoe, untouched by weather, perfectly clean. When I picked it up, the air pulsed, like the mountain had exhaled, and I remembered something that wasn't mine. A woman calling out a child's name, a boy falling down a ravine, a community gathering to search, a funeral with no body, a mother never leaving her porch again. And then the shoe in her hand returned years later, dry, unscuffed, left on the steps by something she never saw. The people of Elkmont hadn't just died. Well, they were still doing things, rebuilding, reorganizing, recruiting. You ever feel like you're trespassing on a memory? Like you've wandered into a place that doesn't know it's supposed to be gone? That's what Elkmont felt like the morning I saw the new barn. Well, I had been walking through what the old maps called Maple Hollow. Nothing had ever been built there, just forest and a dry stream. But now, a 2-story barn, paint still fresh, the scent of sawdust lingering in the air. Not a relic, not a restoration. This thing was new. The boards weren't milled by machines. They were hand-cut, pegged together the way builders did 100 years ago. No nails, no modern signatures, but it wasn't abandoned. Inside were tools, not rusted, not dusty, active. Hammers, chisels, hand drills, arranged neatly on a wooden bench, blueprints sketched in charcoal, and a name etched at the bottom corner. Elkmont Reclamation Society to Tlot. There was no such organization in any record. Jikid. Park rangers would arrive at the Elkmont area to find that buildings scheduled for demolition had been mysteriously repaired overnight. The materials used for these repairs were always historically accurate. I began keeping notes, recording each structure that hadn't existed the day before, and the list kept growing. Not just homes and barns now, an old schoolhouse, desks lined up, a bakery with real bread cooling on the windowsill, still warm. I touched it. My fingers sank into the crust like it had been baked that morning. And then there were the residents, not all at once, not in crowds, but one or two at a time, watching, moving between trees, standing in doorways. The first time one of them spoke to me, it was a little boy. He was sitting on the steps of a house I hadn't seen before, kicking his feet and humming something old. I passed him quietly, unsure if he was real. And then he said, "They're almost done with the church." I turned. "What church?" He just smiled. "The one you'll need soon," and vanished. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, hearing the steady thump of hammers on wood, The creak of beams being lifted, whispered instructions in voices too low to follow. They were building, rebuilding. More unsettling were the discoveries of personal belongings that shouldn't have existed here. When these items were collected and cataloged, they would often disappear from secure storage facilities, only to reappear in their original locations. In the morning, I found a photograph in my bag that I had never taken, me, standing in front of the bakery I discovered the day before, with the boy smiling beside me. But I had been alone, and my camera was still zipped shut in my tent pocket. But the final straw came when I returned to the Wonderland Hotel. Only now, it was fully restored. A man in suspenders stood at the door polishing the brass handle. He nodded as I approached. "Room's ready for you," he said. "You're checked in through Thursday." I opened my mouth to object, but then saw the key in my hand. Wooden fob, brass number 214, and behind him, through the open doors, was a warm lobby, glowing with firelight and conversation. I walked away fast. I didn't want to know what would happen if I crossed that threshold. But I had a feeling that others had, to be continued in Chapter 4, The Recruited. You don't notice how far you've gone until you try to go back. On my 5th day in Elkmont, I tried to leave. Trail signs had changed. GPS refused to connect. The terrain no longer matched any map I'd brought. The forest had turned alien, and the forest was talking. Not words, but presence, intent. Every step I took away from the town felt resisted, like the ground itself didn't want me gone. I ran into another hiker that day, or so I thought. She looked normal. Hiking boots, camera bag, sun hat, but her eyes weren't quite right. Too calm, too still. We spoke briefly. "You lost?" she asked, but not with concern. "Yeah, trying to get back to the main road." She smiled. "You've got time. There's no rush. Have you seen the church yet?" I hadn't told her anything. I hadn't mentioned the boy, the photo, or the buildings. That night, I found a folded note under my sleeping mat. "You can stay if you want. You'd be a good neighbor. Visitor." Gradually encouraged to stay longer and longer until they begin to lose track of time and forget about their lives outside the mountains. I began forgetting things. My phone wouldn't power on. My compass spun in slow, deliberate circles. The date on my notebook was smudged, as if I'd written it in rain, but it hadn't rained in days. I checked my bag and found canned food that wasn't mine. A hand-stitched shirt I didn't recognize. A book titled Life in Elkmont, Volume 1 that didn't exist in any library. Someone or something was preparing me to stay. Then I saw the list, carved into the wood of a church pew that hadn't existed 2 days earlier. Jacob Turner, Anne Holloway, Benjamin Stokes, Carla Moreau, me. 5 names, all recently missing from the surrounding counties. According to a local news clipping I found nailed to the church bulletin board. That night, I ran. No plan, just movement. I sprinted through the woods, ignoring branches that tore at my arms, roots that tripped me. I didn't care where I was going, only that it wasn't deeper into town. I finally collapsed near the river. My lungs burned, My hands were bleeding. I didn't know how long I'd been running. Then I saw her again. The woman from the trail, she stood across the river, not crossing, just watching. "Don't worry," she called. "You'll come back." They always do. And the woods behind us began to glow with light. Dozens of homes, windows flickering, phantom residents moving like memories given form. And in the distance, I saw a new water tower, one that hadn't been there even in the town's prime. Elkmont wasn't rebuilding what it had been. It was building something new. You think you'll forget it once you're out, that the forest will let you go, that time and traffic and noise will drown it out. But Elkmont isn't something you forget. Elkmont remembers you. Ah, dear. I made it out. Somehow, I stumbled onto a service trail and was picked up by a ranger. He said I looked like I'd been out there for weeks. I tried to argue it had only been 5 days. Then he showed me the date. 17 days had passed. I'd lost 2 weeks, gone like smoke between the trees. He asked me where I had been. I told him, Elkmont. His eyes narrowed. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he leaned in and whispered, "You stayed too long. Some never come back." They took me to a park medical station till I was dehydrated, bruised, paranoid. They chalked it up to exposure and hallucinations. But hallucinations don't send you home with extra items. When they gave me back my bag, I found a wooden toy I didn't recognize, initials carved in the base. I found a postcard postmarked Elkmont, Tennessee, addressed to no one. And I still had that photograph of me and the boy. The problem, I never gave that photo to anyone. I started researching, talking to families of the missing, digging through local archives, and I wasn't the only one. People were disappearing near Elkmont, always solo hikers, always last seen in or near the valley. They weren't running off. They weren't unprepared. They were being chosen. Several missing person cases in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park have been linked to last known sightings in the Elkmont area, though no bodies have ever been recovered. And then I found her. Carla Moreau, one of the names carved into the pew. She'd gone missing in 1998. Her sister still kept a journal from the time. Inside were sketches of houses that hadn't existed in 1998 but did now. Sketches of my face. I haven't returned, not physically, but Elkmont still visits me in dreams, in strange shadows, on street corners. Once, I swear, I saw the boy from the photo watching me from across the street just before the streetlight flickered out. And I've begun to change. I forget things now. Important things, like where I parked, what city I'm in, my mother's voice. In their place, I remember things I never lived. I remember planting squash behind the bakery. I remember fishing the creek with the Holloway twins. I remember burying my first dog near the Wonderland Hotel. Memories that don't belong to me, unless they do now. They say the phantom buildings were just echoes of what once was. But what if that was just phase 1? I've spoken to rangers, hikers, researchers. They're starting to see things that never existed before. A fire station, a water tower, a general store with digital displays, a cell tower that doesn't show up on signal maps. And when they try to photograph them, Nothing appears. But when I close my eyes, I can see them clearly. Elkmont is evolving. It's not recreating the past anymore. It's building a future, its own. I found a thread on a paranormal forum buried deep. Only 2 replies. It was a man claiming he'd spoken with the town's mayor. Said the mayor wore suspenders, smelled like pine, and welcomed him warmly. We're not ghosts, the mayor said. We're memory given flesh. We're the next version of what you left behind. The poster disappeared a week later. No trace. I believe him, because in my last dream of Elkmont, I saw the mayor too. And he called me by name. I'm writing this now in a motel, 3 states away. I keep the lights on all night. But last night, the lamp flickered, and the shadows on the wall didn't match my body. They matched the furniture from my room in Elkmont. And this morning, the motel clerk handed me a key someone left for me. Wooden fob, brass number. If you're reading this, you've already heard the stories. Maybe you laughed. Maybe you're curious. Maybe you're packing a tent right now. Don't, because Elkmont isn't haunted. It's hungry. It doesn't want visitors. It wants residents. These visitors would describe elaborate social interactions. Only when they tried to leave would they realize the friendly neighbors who had welcomed them were nothing more than memories given supernatural form. I've stopped trying to resist it. But every day I forget more of who I was. Every night I remember more of who I'm supposed to be. They've built me a house. A 2-bedroom, cedar-paneled cabin on the East Ridge. There's a rocking chair on the porch. A dog that doesn't need feeding. A neighbor who brings pie made from berries that no longer grow in the real world. And they ask me each day, will you stay this time? This morning I said yes. So if you visit Elkmont now, you may find me. I'll wave from the porch. I might even invite you in for coffee. And if you taste the pie, it's already too late, because Elkmont lives through those who remember it. And now I remember everything. Story number 8. They warned me I'd pull up there alone. Said the mountain watches. Said the lights follow. But I wasn't looking for warnings. I was looking for answers. The night I climbed Brown Mountain, I wasn't chasing legends. I was chasing a name I'd only heard once, whispered from a dying woman who still smelled like firewood and regret. My grandmother's voice cracked when she said it, Arakulaka, and then she was gone. She left behind a leather pouch, a hand-drawn map, and a curse I didn't understand until it was too late. I first saw the lights when I was 16. My father had driven us out to a gravel overlook near Linville Gorge. The sky was velvet black, smeared with stars, the kind of quiet that dares you to speak. We had just finished a bag of stale trail mix when it happened. Across the ridgeline. A soft glow blinked once, then again, hovering above the tree line like a lantern held by an invisible hand. Others joined it. Not random, not drifting like fog. These things moved. With rhythm, with intention. We watched in silence, both of us leaning forward in unison, as if that could bring us closer. I remember my father whispering something. I thought he said, "They're looking," but I never asked what for. Years passed. The lights became one of those half memories you question until they find you again. And they did, on a rainy night in July, decades later. When my grandmother died, she had Cherokee blood, though she never spoke much of it. Her death brought out stories that no one had dared tell while she was alive. One of them was about Brown Mountain. The year was 1771, and the Cherokee Nation was locked in a brutal war with the Catawba tribe over hunting rights and territorial boundaries in the mountains of what would later become North Carolina and Tennessee. This wasn't a conflict between ranges. The Cherokee and Catawba had been neighbors for generations, their territories overlapping in the rich hunting grounds around Brown Mountain. But as European colonization pressure mounted and traditional hunting areas became scarce, the two tribes found themselves competing for resources that had once been abundant enough to share. It was more than a story, they said. It was a wound, still open. My grandmother had always lit candles near a map of the Smokies. She'd murmur things in a language I didn't understand. After she died, I followed those murmurs. They led me to her journals, mostly prayers, some warnings, and one page that simply said, "When you see the lights, do not follow. That is how they find new names." But I couldn't help myself. I had to go. The war had been raging for 3 years when the Cherokee war chief Atakulaka made the decision that would create one of the most haunting supernatural phenomena in North American history. Rather than continue the grinding campaign of raids and counter-raids that was bleeding both tribes dry, he proposed a single decisive battle that would settle the territorial dispute once and for all. The location he chose was Brown Mountain itself, a sacred site to both tribes, a place where the spirits of ancestors were said to gather, and where the outcome of such a battle would carry the weight of divine judgment. I camped near Wiseman's View, a precarious overlook that jutted out over an ancient gorge. I pitched a small tent, cooked bland beans from a can, and waited, not for the lights this time, but for the pull. It came around midnight. Trey, I wasn't dreaming. At least, I don't think I was. I heard drums, distant, deep, and steady. Not mechanical, not echoing from some local festival. This rhythm came from beneath me, from the bones of the mountain. And then I saw them, not lights, not yet. People, dozens of them. Women wrapped in deerskin shawls, holding torches that didn't burn with fire, but with a soft amber glow, like memory. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes burned. They moved silently through the forest, feet not so much walking as gliding. They passed within feet of me and never looked up. And then, like that, they were gone. The mountain was quiet again. The women established their own camp on a ridge overlooking Brown Mountain, far enough from the planned battle site to be safe from the fighting, but close enough to see what transpired. There were over 100 of them, young wives clutching babies, elderly mothers whose sons were fighting their first major battle, sisters who had never been separated from their brothers, and daughters who had begged to be allowed to accompany their fathers to war. I opened the pouch my grandmother had left behind. Inside was a strip of cloth stained dark, almost black. It smelled of cedar and thyme. Wrapped within it was a small carved bead in the shape of an eye. No string, no note, just the bees. When I held it in my palm, the air shifted, and the lights returned. This time, I wasn't at a distance. They hovered around me, close enough to touch. They circled, then slowed, as if examining. A few drew nearer, and I could see that they weren't orbs at all, not entirely. They had faces, yes, not detailed, not human, but impressions, like memory wearing a mask. And they spoke, not with voices, but with movement. One rose high, then dipped. Another swayed left to right. Together, they repeated the pattern over and over again. A code, Cherokee tradition, demanded that the bodies of fallen warriors be recovered and given proper burial rites within 24 hours of death, or their souls would be trapped between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. The women understood that they had to find their loved ones quickly, not just for their own peace of mind, but for the spiritual welfare of the entire tribe. If Cherokee warriors were left unburied on the battlefield, their restless spirits could bring disaster upon the entire nation. I stayed on that ridge until morning. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. The lights never left. By dawn, the sky was pale and cloudless, and the mountain was empty. No tracks, no sign of fire. My gear was untouched, but inside my tent, the carved bead now lay beside an unfamiliar pouch, this one made of bark and twine. Inside it was a small stone blade. Fresh blood coated the edge, and beneath it, a single line etched in my grandmother's handwriting. The search never ends. You'd think a mountain would forget, given enough time, but Brown Mountain remembers. It remembers every name shouted into the night, every step taken with shaking hands and a dying torch, every promise whispered through clenched teeth. I used to think ghosts just haunted places. I didn't know places could haunt back. The second night I stayed on the mountain, I didn't bring fire. No flashlight, no camp stove, no lantern. I brought the blade. I don't know why. It just felt right. Like something was expected of me. Like the lights were waiting. I stood on the same ridge. The forest below me breathed in rhythm, trees creaking under their own weight, as if even the land knew it was standing on sacred ground. When the wind shifted, it carried with it the faint scent of smoke and something older, ashes long scattered, blood soaked deep into the soil. The first light appeared just after moonrise, not in the sky, but between the trees. Then another, and another. They did not rise. They marched. As the first stars appeared in the October sky, the Cherokee women took up their torches and began their descent toward the battlefield. They moved in small groups, calling out the names of their loved ones and praying to the spirits for guidance in their search. The torches cast dancing circles of light across the blood-soaked ground, illuminating scenes of devastation that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They came in lines, 5 across, then 7, moving silently, with impossible coordination. But they weren't aimless. Each light was pulled toward something, pausing, hovering, and continuing on, like bees returning to a hive that no longer existed. They passed me again, But this time, one paused. It floated just a few feet from me, pulsing gently. Then it lowered itself toward the ground, illuminating a patch of dead pine needles. I stepped closer. Sure, there was nothing there. No bones, no artifacts, only soil, and the unmistakable feeling that someone had once lain here, waiting to be found. The light pulsed once more, brighter this time. I dropped to my knees and began to dig. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a flint arrowhead or a broken blade. But instead, I uncovered a scrap of red fabric, frayed and half consumed by time. A burial sash. I held it up, and the light surged forward, then split into three. The others joined it, and together, the lights spun in a slow circle before rising into the air and vanishing one by one. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was fulfilled. Some of the women found their husbands or sons quickly and were able to begin the sacred burial rites immediately. But others searched for hours without success. Their torches growing dim as their supply of oil and pine pitch was exhausted. Their voices growing hoarse from calling names that would never be answered again. Later that night, I returned to my tent and found another offering. This time it wasn't wrapped. It laid directly on the ground, placed with reverence, a braid of human hair, bound by a carved bead nearly identical to the one from my grandmother, except this one was cracked. A note scratched into a folded square of bark sat beneath it. Some searches continue because the living demand it, others because the dead refuse to stop. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I made my way to the eastern side of the mountain where the sun touches first. I found a grove of stone outcroppings shaped like a half-buried bones. The map my grandmother left had marked this place with a symbol I didn't understand. A hand with 3 lines across the palm. Now I know what it meant. It was the mark of the ones who stayed behind, the mothers. The tragedy of Brown Mountain deepened as the women realized that their one night of searching would not be sufficient. They would have to return the following night and the night after that and every night thereafter until every Cherokee warrior had been accounted for. What began as a desperate attempt to recover the bodies of fallen warriors gradually evolved into something much more profound and disturbing. They say grief can pass through blood. I believe that now. Because as I stood in that grove, I felt something awaken in me. Not a memory, but an echo. My hands began to tremble. My chest tightened like it was remembering someone else's sorrow. 1,000 voices began to rise from beneath the ground, not screaming, not moaning, just calling. Names. So many names, spoken in a language I didn't understand, but felt. One voice was louder than the others. It spoke a name I knew, my son. Atakulaka. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but the grove was empty, except for the lights. Dozens of them, and all of them were pointed toward me. As weeks passed and the searches continued, the women began to report strange experiences that suggested their nightly vigils were attracting supernatural attention. They would see lights moving across the battlefield that weren't torches carried by other searchers. Mysterious glowing orbs that seemed to move with purpose and intelligence, often leading the women to bodies they hadn't been able to find on their own. They didn't advance. They waited, son. And when I stepped forward, they parted like a curtain. But in the center stood something I still struggle to describe. It was a woman, or it had been. Her face shimmered between ages, young, old, mother, daughter, widow, all at once. She did not walk. She floated, and she carried no torch because her body was the flame. She looked at me, then pointed to the cracked bead in my hand, and I understood. She was one of the first, a mother who had refused to leave, one of the ones who burned so her son wouldn't be alone. I knelt and held out the bead. She touched it, and it dissolved into light. Then she whispered, not in sound, but into my bones, "He is still missing. Will you search?" I nodded, and the forest exploded into light. Oh, but no one tells you how hard it is to stop searching once you've started. The mountain doesn't let you forget, and neither do the dead. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Those lights, those faces, those eyes that never blinked. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Because now they were calling me by name. The next night, I returned to the grove with only one thing in my hand, the pouch my grandmother left behind. It felt heavier than before. I untied the leather cord, and instead of the usual bead or bone fragment, I found a folded strip of hide with symbols burned into it, ancient Cherokee. I couldn't read them, but I recognized them, not with my mind, but something older, buried inside me like a memory I was never supposed to access. I held the strip up to the stars, and the lights responded. They swarmed, not with malice, but with urgency, a vortex of flame and soul and grief, twisting above the forest like a storm given purpose. And in the center, I saw them. The first disappearances occurred in late November, when several of the searchers simply failed to return from their nightly vigil. Search parties sent to look for them found only their torches still burning at spots scattered across Brown Mountain, with no sign of the women who had been carrying them. The missing women's families assumed they had become lost in the darkness and died of exposure, but their bodies were never found despite extensive searches. They weren't just lost, they were still there, but not whole, not entirely themselves, trapped in the liminal, souls stretched thin between memory and purpose, duty and death. Women whose eyes were bright with devotion, but whose mouths never moved. They circled me now, not as a threat, but as witnesses. The dead were watching, waiting, and I was standing in their courtroom. I held the hide in my hand like a verdict, and then I saw him. He wasn't a spirit, not like the others. He had a body solid, breathing. He wore modern boots, a torn hiking pack strapped to one shoulder, and eyes that shimmered with distant light. He stepped out from the trees, confused, trembling. "Where am I?" he asked. And that's when I understood. He was one of them, not from the past, from the present. By spring, all of the original searchers had vanished, leaving behind only their torches scattered across Brown Mountain and the mysterious lights that continued to appear every night. The Cherokee survivors understood that the women had made the ultimate sacrifice, choosing to continue their search in death rather than abandon their spiritual obligations in life. The lights don't just mourn the past, they collect the present. Every year, more vanish, Hikers, campers, tourists chasing legends. The lights draw them in, test them, consume them, not out of cruelty, but out of hunger, the hunger of memory, the need to finish the search. And if you show compassion, if you remember, the mountain offers you a choice. I approached the man. He looked no older than 20. His voice cracked as he said, I was following something, lights. Then, I don't know, I gave him the hide. The moment it touched his skin, the air shimmered, the lights paused, and one by one, they began to sing, not with voices, with heat, with presence, with belonging. It was beautiful, terrible, and then they left. Every single one vanished into the trees like a story that had finally been told. I descended the mountain that night in silence. No lights followed me, no whispers, shushers, just stars overhead, and the knowledge that something ancient had recognized me and released me. Hushki, but not forever, because when I reached the trailhead, I found something waiting for me, resting against the back of my car like a final word. A torch, still burning. Travelers through the region continued to report seeing mysterious lights moving across the mountain, always at night, always appearing to search for something that could never be found. Early European settlers described seeing torches carried by figures that vanished when approached, and later witnesses reported glowing orbs that moved with obvious intelligence and purpose. I still see the lights sometimes, even miles from the mountain, in reflections, in dreams, in moments when the wind shifts just right and I hear drums that no one else hears. Sometimes when I walk near the tree line behind my house, a single orb will appear, just hovering, waiting, but I never follow. Not anymore, because I know what waits. And I know now the lights aren't looking for the dead. They're looking for the living who still carry the names, the grief bearers, the memory holders, the ones who still whisper through generations. Recent witnesses to the Brown Mountain Lights report that the phenomenon has evolved over the decades, with the lights appearing to respond to modern technology in ways that suggest they are aware of changes in the world around them. Most disturbing are reports from visitors who claim the lights have communicated with them directly using patterns of movement that spell out words or convey simple messages. Some report feeling overwhelming compulsions to join the eternal search, to take up torches of their own and become part of the phenomenon that has continued for over 2 centuries. So I keep the torch unlit, wrapped in cloth and buried at the back of my closet. But on quiet nights, when everything feels too heavy, I find myself standing at the window, wondering if they'll come for me again, and if next time I'll say yes, because some names stay with you, some searches never end, and some lights never die.